The double doors of Judge Judy's courtroom swung open on a brisk Thursday morning. But 4-year-old Julian Hayes didn't just walk in, he floated in on a cloud of unearned, consequence-free privilege. Wearing a bespoke $5,000 Tom Ford suit and checking his gold Rolex with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his entire life, Julian treated the most feared courtroom in America like an inconvenient waiting room at a country club. He was the nephew of a sitting United States senator, a man whose family name was practically carved into the marble of Capitol Hill. Julian believed that name was an impenetrable shield. He had no idea it was about to become a bullseye. Across the aisle sat Thomas Vance, a 6'8" retired FDNY firefighter. Thomas didn't have a bespoke suit. He wore a simple, pressed navy blazer and held a worn manila folder with hands that had spent 30 years pulling people out of burning buildings. Thomas was suing for $10,000, the maximum allowed in small claims after Julian, driving his senator uncle's leased Mercedes G-Wagon while heavily intoxicated, had plowed straight through the front window of Thomas's small, post-retirement hardware store in Brooklyn. But Thomas wasn't just there for the money to repair his shattered storefront. He was there because of what happened after the crash. As Thomas had rushed down in his pajamas to survey the devastating ruins of his life savings, Julian hadn't apologized. Instead, Julian had tossed a crisp $100 bill onto the shattered glass, laughed, and slurred the words that would soon cost his family their political empire. "Clean it up, old man. My family makes the rules in this state. You can't touch me." Those arrogant words were the exact reason Thomas found the courage to file the lawsuit. Every viral courtroom moment has the same explosive ingredients: a villain drunk on power, a victim crushed by an unfair system, and a judge who has spent decades waiting for the exact moment those worlds collide. Julian thought his uncle's political connections made him untouchable. He was about to learn that Judge Judy had spent her entire weekend reading a sealed Federal Election Commission dossier that Julian's uncle had spent millions trying to bury. The case, on paper, should have been a quick 15-minute segment, a straightforward property damage claim easily handled before the morning coffee got cold, $10,000 in damages to a storefront, a late-night accident on Fifth Avenue in Park Slope. But Thomas Vance wasn't suing for the cost of the plate glass window or the damaged inventory. He wasn't even suing because Julian Hayes had been driving at twice the speed limit while live streaming to his 50,000 Instagram followers. Thomas was suing because that hardware store wasn't just a business. It was his retirement dream, built entirely by hand, using the payout he received after his lungs were permanently damaged during the September 11th rescue efforts. He had spent his entire life running into collapsing structures to save strangers. And now, a 4-year-old trust fund kid reeking of expensive vodka and cheap cologne, had casually destroyed it with a Mercedes he didn't even own, tossing a $100 bill at a decorated hero as if he were tipping a valet. But Julian Hayes had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that Judge Judy, with her 35 years of crushing entitled bullies under her gavel, despised nothing more than a coward hiding behind a powerful family name. Julian also had no idea that his uncle, Senator Robert Hayes, was the central figure in a rapidly unspooling federal investigation regarding millions in misappropriated campaign funds. He had no idea that the very Mercedes G-Wagon he had crashed into Thomas's store was registered to a shell company, a company federal investigators believed was used to launder those exact campaign contributions. And Julian absolutely had no idea that Judge Judy was about to deliver a legal and moral smackdown so devastating, so publicly humiliating, that it would force his uncle to issue a frantic public apology on live television before the sun went down. Julian strutted to the defendant's podium like he was walking a red carpet. He made a show of checking his phone, actively ignoring the bailiff's stern look. Beside him stood his attorney, a $1,000 an hour fixer named Arthur Vance, who looked physically ill. Arthur had spent the entire cab ride begging Julian to show an ounce of humility, but looking at his client now, Arthur knew it was hopeless. Julian believed his last name was a get-out-of-jail-free card. He was about to discover it was a one-way ticket to federal exposure. The courtroom fell into a hushed, suffocating silence as Judge Judy looked up from her meticulously organized manila folder. She didn't yell. She didn't slam her gavel. She just let her eyes lock onto Julian's smirk for 3 agonizingly long seconds. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice razor-sharp and ice-cold, "put the phone away. You are not at a cocktail party, and I am not one of your sycophants." The atmosphere inside the courtroom that morning was thick with an electric, almost suffocating tension. Julian Hayes didn't just stand at the defendant's podium. He leaned against it, legs crossed at the ankles, picking at his manicured fingernails, as if the entire judicial process was a mild inconvenience, keeping him from a brunch reservation. Next to him stood his high-powered Washington, D.C. attorney, a man who charged $1,200 an hour, but currently looked physically ill. He had spent the entire morning begging his 4-year-old client to show just 1 ounce of remorse. But looking at Julian now, adjusting his designer tie and rolling his eyes at the cameras, the lawyer knew it was absolutely hopeless. Julian had internalized the central truth of his privileged existence. Consequences were for the working class. On the other side of the aisle, the contrast was so stark it was heartbreaking. Thomas Vance stood perfectly straight, possessing the quiet, rigid dignity of a man who had spent 3 decades running into burning buildings while everyone else ran out. He didn't bring a high-priced lawyer. He didn't bring an entourage. He brought only a small, scorched brass bell, the original bell from his hardware store's front door. It was the only thing he managed to salvage from the wreckage after Julian's Mercedes obliterated his retirement dream. Thomas had built that store with his own 2 hands using his FDNY pension, meant to be a quiet sanctuary after a lifetime of breathing in smoke and ash. And now, it was gone, crushed under the tires of a trust fund joyride. Judge Judy didn't immediately speak. For a full 10 seconds, an eternity in television time, she just sat there, her hands folded over a thick, sealed manila folder on her desk, her eyes fixed on Julian with the terrifying stillness of an apex predator watching its prey wander into a trap. Finally, her voice cut through the silence, surgical and cold. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her tone giving away absolutely nothing, "explain to this court, in your own words, what happened on the night in question." Julian sighed dramatically, the kind of heavy sigh a teenager gives a teacher. "Look, Your Honor, this is a massive overreaction. The guy's store was practically falling apart anyway. I tapped his window, and my family's insurance has already offered him a settlement. I even gave him cash on the spot to clean up the mess. My uncle is Senator Robert Hayes. I have a flight to Geneva at 4 o'clock, so I genuinely don't understand why we are wasting taxpayer dollars on a glorified fender bender." The gallery audibly gasped. A retired police officer in the second row shook his head in pure disgust. Even Julian's attorney closed his eyes and groaned. But Julian just smirked, utterly convinced he had just won the case, radiating that untouchable energy. He had no idea that Judge Judy had just silently opened the manila folder containing his uncle's unredacted Federal Election Commission report. The trap was perfectly set. The courtroom was so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Judge Judy let Julian's dismissive words hang in the air, a pathetic testament to his own ignorance. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She let the weight of her presence do the work. "Your family handles things, Mr. Hayes?" Judge Judy's voice was surgical, cutting through the smugness that radiated off the defendant like heat off asphalt. She pulled a single, crisp document from the manila folder, a bank wire transfer record, stamped with the unmistakable, authoritative seal of the Department of Justice. "You claim this G-Wagon was your personal vehicle, bought with family money. My records from the Department of Transportation show it's registered to a holding company called Apex Capital Solutions, a company which, curiously, has been under a quiet investigation for the last 14 months by federal auditors." Julian's smirk faltered, just for a split second. He shifted his weight, suddenly realizing the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist was feeling significantly heavier. "It's a family business, Judge. It's complicated. My uncle handles the logistics. It's private capital." "It's not complicated at all," Judy snapped, her eyes locking onto his with the intensity of a laser. "It is, in fact, quite simple. Apex Capital Solutions hasn't filed a legitimate tax return in 3 years. Yet, they managed to fund a $150,000 vehicle in cash, and those funds, Mr. Hayes, appear to have been diverted from a municipal disaster relief contract, a contract intended for the very neighborhood Thomas Vance served for 30 years. The gallery, which had been buzzing with whispers, went absolutely dead. The gravity of the accusation slammed into the room like a physical weight. Thomas Vance looked at the judge, his face a mask of dawning disbelief. He hadn't just been hit by a drunk driver. He had been hit by a systematic parasite of the community he had sworn to protect. He had risked his life for this city, only for this boy to treat the city's relief funds like his personal allowance. Julian's attorney, Arthur Vance, looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. He slowly, deliberately shifted his chair a few inches away from his client. It was the universal courtroom sign that he was preparing to throw Julian to the wolves, distancing himself from the toxic fallout that was clearly about to occur. That's ridiculous, Julian stammered, his voice climbing an octave, his bravado finally beginning to fray at the edges. My family is a pillar of the community. You're reading some basement-level conspiracy theory that has nothing to do with a fender bender. I am reading, Judge Judy said, holding the document up so the cameras could get a perfect, crystal-clear shot of the seal, from a federal subpoena issued yesterday, a subpoena that includes the sworn testimony of your uncle's former chief of staff. And let me tell you, Mr. Hayes, once the feds start asking questions about where the campaign money went, they usually don't stop until they find the answer. You didn't just drive into a store, Mr. Hayes. You drove yourself into the center of a federal sting. Julian's face went white. The swagger evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, exposed young man. He looked toward the gallery, perhaps expecting his uncle to burst through the doors with a squadron of lawyers, but there was only silence. He was, for the first time in his life, entirely alone. The courtroom doors didn't just open, they were pushed aside with a heavy, deliberate finality. Everyone turned. Walking into the chamber, with a stride that was usually reserved for the Senate floor, was Senator Robert Hayes. But he wasn't wearing the polished veneer of a political titan today. He looked gray, exhausted, and remarkably fragile, as if he had aged a decade in the span of the last hour. He didn't look at his nephew. He didn't offer a nod to the gallery. He kept his eyes locked on the floor, walking toward the witness stand, with the heavy tread of a man who realized he was walking into his own political funeral. Julian's face lit up for a fleeting second, a desperate, pathetic spark of hope. Uncle Robert, finally, tell them everything is a misunderstanding. Tell them this is just business. Senator Hayes stopped. He didn't respond to Julian. He took the oath with a voice that was barely audible, then sat down. He looked at Judge Judy, who was watching him with a gaze that could strip paint off a wall. She didn't offer him the courtesy of a friendly greeting. She got straight to the meat of the matter. Senator Hayes, she said, her voice echoing in the dead silence, your nephew has claimed that the vehicle involved in this accident and the funds used to operate his shell company were part of a legitimate family business managed by your office. Is that testimony accurate? The senator looked at his hands, then at Thomas Vance, the man whose life's work his nephew had destroyed for a thrill. The senator saw the brass bell sitting on the evidence table, a symbol of the hard, honest work that he had spent his career pretending to represent. The senator's face hardened. He realized that if he lied, the federal subpoena sitting on the judge's desk would trigger a perjury charge that would end his career instantly. If he told the truth, he might survive, but Julian would be completely on his own. That testimony, the senator said, his voice cracking, is entirely inaccurate, Your Honor. Julian's jaw dropped. What? Uncle Robert, what are you doing? Tell her about the trust. There is no trust, Julian, the senator replied, finally looking him in the eye, his expression one of cold, detached pity. There is only a series of reckless decisions and illegal diversions of funds that were meant for the city's safety. I have spent the last 3 years trying to keep you out of trouble, hoping you would grow up. I see now that was a mistake. I have handed over all financial records, including the internal memos that link Apex Capital Solutions to my campaign office, to the Department of Justice. The gallery erupted in a low, shocked murmur. The senator had just handed his own nephew to the prosecutors on a silver platter. He had chosen the law, or perhaps he had chosen his own survival over the family loyalty Julian had banked his entire life on. Judge Judy didn't look surprised. She looked satisfied. Senator, you are under oath. Do you understand the implication of what you are saying? I understand perfectly, the senator replied, his voice regaining some of its usual steel. I am here to ensure that justice is served. My family does not make the rules. The law does. The courtroom was thick with the scent of ozone and impending catastrophe as the senator's testimony echoed in the rafters. Julian Hayes stood frozen at the podium, the color completely drained from his face. The untouchable heir was now undeniably vulnerable, his lifeline severed by the very man he had tried to hide behind. His attorney, seeing the writing on the wall, had retreated so far behind the table that he was practically out of the frame. Judge Judy didn't let the silence linger. She was done with the theatrics of the senator's betrayal. It was time to close the book on Julian's arrogance. She leaned forward, the black robe settling over her shoulders like a suit of armor. "Mr. Hayes, look at me," she commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a gravity that pulled every eye in the room toward her. Julian slowly looked up, his jaw slack, his expensive suit now looking like a shroud. "You see your uncle? You see a man who spent his life building a legacy. A man who realized in the span of 30 seconds that he wasn't going to let a spoiled, entitled child burn it to the ground. That is what a man does when he realizes he's wrong. You, on the other hand, spent the last hour treating this courtroom like a playground. You threw $100 at a man who carries the physical scars of the worst tragedy this city has ever seen, and you thought that was enough." She picked up the manila folder again, ignoring the stifled sobs coming from the gallery. "You aren't just facing a civil suit for a totaled storefront. You are facing a criminal indictment. My staff has already forwarded the transcript of this hearing, including your own admission that your family makes the rules and your uncle's testimony regarding the misappropriation of municipal disaster relief funds, to the District Attorney of Kings County and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You walked in here thinking your name was in armor. You walked into a slaughterhouse of your own making." Julian tried to speak, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the mahogany railing to keep from falling. "Your Honor, please. I didn't. My uncle is mistaken." "Stop," she commanded, the gavel coming down with a force that seemed to rattle the very foundation of the building. "Don't you dare speak to me of mistakes. You destroyed a man's livelihood, mocked his service, and attempted to use the United States Senate as a shield for your own petty, criminal entitlement. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff, Miss Thomas Vance, for the full amount of $10,000 in compensatory damages. Furthermore, I am assessing punitive damages in the amount of $50,000 for your malicious conduct and the willful obstruction of justice, as evidenced by your own testimony." She leaned forward, her eyes locked onto his, unblinking, relentless. "And as for your flight to Geneva, consider it canceled. The federal authorities are waiting outside those doors to escort you to a holding facility. You aren't going to Switzerland. You're going to jail." The bailiff stepped forward, his expression devoid of sympathy. Julian Hayes, the boy who thought he made the rules, was finally about to learn what happened when the rules were actually enforced. Judge Judy stared at Julian, her expression unreadable, her gaze fixed on the man who, only minutes ago, had believed himself to be untouchable. "Senator Hayes, you are excused. I suspect you have many more questions to answer elsewhere today." The senator nodded once, looking aged, hollowed out, and remarkably diminished. He exited through the side door without casting a single glance at his nephew. The betrayal was total. The political shield was shattered. The courtroom was deathly quiet. Julian Hayes looked as if the gravity of the room had doubled, physically pressing him into the floor. He tried to speak, but the arrogance that had filled him just an hour ago was entirely replaced by a hollow, shaking terror. He was a shell of the man who had walked in, his designer tie now slightly askew, his expensive suit looking more like a shroud than a status symbol. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Judy started, her voice cutting through the silence like a guillotine. "You built a castle on a foundation of stolen money and political favors. You thought you were the exception to the laws that govern the rest of humanity. You laughed at a man who gave his blood and sweat for this city, thinking his service was a weakness you could buy off with a $100 bill." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink into the conscience of everyone present. "There is no private capital that absolves you of your humanity. There is no last name that excuses vehicular assault or the destruction of a veteran's life work. Power was never meant to be a shield, Mr. Hayes. And today, your shield has failed you completely." She grabbed her pen, signing the judgment form with a quick, decisive stroke. "Judgment for the plaintiff, Mr. Thomas Vance, in the amount of $10,000 for the property damage. Additionally, I am awarding punitive damages in the amount of $50,000 for your malicious conduct and the willful obstruction of justice, as evidenced by your own testimony. These funds are not coming from a corporate trust, Mr. Hayes. They are coming from the personal liquid assets linked to your accounts, the accounts the federal government has already been notified to freeze." Julian let out a strangled, incoherent noise. He collapsed onto the table, his face buried in his hands, his composure completely shattered. The high-priced attorney didn't move to comfort him, already distancing himself from the toxic fallout. Thomas Vance, meanwhile, stood still, He wasn't cheering, he wasn't gloating, he simply closed his eyes and let out a single, long-held breath of relief. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of the injustice felt lighter. Judge Judy stood up, her black robe swishing behind her. This court is adjourned. The federal marshals are here to assist you with your next destination, Mr. Hayes. I suggest you listen to them. As the marshals approached the table, Julian didn't fight. He didn't protest. He simply stood up, his suit rumpled and stained with the tears of his own undoing. Character, he was learning the hard way, is what remains when power finally fails.